This is the Thought Leaders Podcast Series, a podcast that explores the ideas that were born out of the Human Connections Generator event, hosted by Ella, the Early Learning and Literacy Alliance of Waterloo Region.
Hello, I'm Sanjay Govindaraj and I'm the Director of Indigenous Initiatives, Anti-Racism, Accessibility and Equity at the City of Waterloo. I'm excited to be introducing the 5th episode of the Thought Leaders podcast series entitled Kindness, Compassion and Neural Connection. Each session at Human Connections began with a conversation between child psychiatrist, author, advocate and Ella advisor Dr. Jean Clinton and a world-renowned expert. The 2-day generator event was a series of discussions with leading experts in the field of child development and well-being. 6 brilliant conversations, then 6 follow-up conversations that brought the issues home. This podcast is the outgrowth from that. We brought together local thought leaders from the Waterloo region to reflect on and discuss what they heard from these experts. In this case, the one and only Dr. Dan Siegel and the profound insights that our local thought leaders brought to the table makes us proud of the social leadership we have here. Let's listen to a bit of Jean and Dan's conversation first.
While life is incredibly precious and what a gift, we can feel that the self is so separate, identity is so constricted, and belonging is so limited that we feel we're disconnected from the world, and we are built to be a part of these larger systems. So when we feel that disconnection in terms of not belonging, then it's tantamount to a body not breathing. Belonging is that important. And so these 3 things are interwoven together, self, identity, and belonging. But I think the major thrust for me of where, as caregivers to each other, we can ask the question, how have modern times gone off? And I think they've gone off by limiting the self to the body, making identity be incredibly constrained, and then belonging be cut off from the larger natural world. And I think we need to learn from indigenous teachings, from contemplative practices, and even use the value of science in applying our best efforts to approach what appears sometimes to be overwhelming problems, but then realize these challenges are also opportunities for growth.
So one of the things that really hit me when I was listening to that conversation was the whole thing about how much it's moved to the I and not the we. And I come from a culture where even when I first moved to Canada in my interview, I kept using the word we. And though I was leading an organization, doing stuff, and later my manager, when she was doing the reference checks, really wanted to know, did I do it or was it the team that did it? And that really stuck to me. So the idea of belonging, idea of doing it together is such a inborn piece that's kind of lost. And I think, the more we kind of bring the community together to kind of have this support for each other, I think people will feel a little more belonging because they've lost it. And I see a lot of people struggling with just the lack of compassion, lack of supports for each other. And I loved how Dr. Siegel was talking a lot more about trying to build that kind of capacity and connections back. Following her conversation with Dr. Siegel, our host, Dr. Jean Clinton, spoke with Dr. Dillon Browne from the Whole Family Lab at the University of Waterloo and T.K. Pritchard, the Executive Director of the Shore Center. Dillon Browne was asked about his first impressions and takeaways from Dr. Siegel's talk.
I was furiously taking notes, and one of the first things he mentioned was that modern times has given a definition of the self that is too constricted. And I absolutely agree with that. And a lot of the work that I do as a researcher and also as a child psychologist, and I'm putting that in parentheses intentionally, and I'll tell you why. has to do with this hyper focus on the individual as the fundamental unit of social organization. And of course, that's the society that we grew up in. That's how we were raised. And in the field of child psychology, child psychiatry, clinical psychology, and related disciplines, we do absolutely situate the individual child at the center of our theoretical models and our view of the contributing factors to human development, what makes people who they are. And so one thing that I was thinking about during the conversation was the importance of not focusing on like a capital I individual as the thing that we study or the thing that we seek to socialize and educate, rather looking at the interconnections as fundamental units. And so for me, that has meant looking at the family as a fundamental unit of organization, something that is inherent in itself, worthy of attention. And I'll do a little bit of a shout out here, a local shout out. The Child Youth Planning Table in Waterloo region is doing some really wonderful work on belonging right now. And I've been fortunate enough to look at some of that data. And absolutely, in these surveys that are being conducted, we're seeing that belonging absolutely is the largest predictor of mental health and well-being among youth in the region. And that, in addition to today's conversation, has led me to think a little bit big picture. And if we are seeing a mental health crisis in our youth, and based on prevalence estimates over the last 2 decades, we are. So then where did the belonging go? There are a number of different hypotheses for that. And of course, one of the common ideas with this mental health crisis that we're seeing in our youth, and I don't mean to be alarmist, but it is something that we're talking about. And one of the ideas has to do with social media. And I think that's kind of very buzzwordy to talk about social media. And there are absolutely benefits to social media. Social media can be a place where marginalized, underrepresented communities come together and do support one another. I suppose one place where it can get tricky is when social media only serves to elevate the I, only serves to elevate the individual, where there is this hyper focus on how am I being perceived? How is this looking for me? What's going on in my corner, as opposed to fostering and facilitating interconnections. So another idea that came up in the chat that I just wanted to shout out is the importance of the humanities. And I think, one of the things that really stands out for me in Dr. Siegel's work and your conversation was the extent to which contemporary child psychiatry is so beautifully woven in with traditions of thought that are generally housed, at least in the universities where I often hang out, in departments of humanities. And as we've increasingly focused on STEM employability and individual performance in these domains, it's possible, and I'm not the first person to bring this up. In fact, I'm relatively new to the idea. It's possible that we've lost sight of our longer historical cultural narratives that have tied us together as a human family. And as we cut those ties and become increasingly isolated, it's not surprising that we feel less belonging, we feel more depressed, we feel more hopeless, isolated, layer a pandemic on top of that, and it's not terribly surprising what's going on. So those were my initial takeaways, and I'm curious to hear what TK thinks, and also what you think about those reflections, Jane.
I agree with you so much, Dr. Browne. That concept of moi that Dan talked about. He said we have to go from me to we, and somebody in one of his audiences said, "I'm mad at you because it's not going from me to we. We have to keep the me in the we, so it's moi." Yeah. So TK, your thoughts and reflections.
Thank you. Yes, I like Dillon. I was also very rapidly taking notes. Mine are on construction paper, which tells you that I'm a parent, because that is what is available in my household. And I think there's, lots of pieces from the talk that were incredibly important. But one of the things that I wrote down, similar to where Dillon was reflecting on belonging, is when he shared when children don't feel that they belong, it's like the body isn't breathing, and how important that is. And I think we talk so much about belonging in our not-for-profit work, in our kind of social justice communities, and, and recognizing the barriers to belonging and the privilege of belonging and how complicated that is. A lot of my work has been with queer youth and also with men and boys around masculinity. And when we look at how we create spaces of belonging, how we can create that connection to community, there's so many barriers in place of folks feeling like they can belong in that community, like they're accepted in that community. And a lot of the youth that I've worked with, they really do struggle to make that connection and to see beyond their own identity, because their identity itself is so ostracized by their peers, by their families, by their educators sometimes, right? And so when I've worked with them, you could see how much the community piece would be important for them. That option was cut off in so many spaces for them. And why it's been so vital, I think, when we do community-based work, to be able to create those types of spaces and communities where youth can build those types of connections, see what's happening for their peers, support one another, look beyond their own experiences, and that naturally isn't happening in their lives all the time. The other thing that I'm thinking about, and I probably wouldn't be a good social justice person if I didn't use the word capitalism at least once, is that it's difficult to look at developing these spaces in the type of society that we are existing in a capitalist society, one which relies so much on productivity, that relies so much on specific outcomes. And both as a community person and as an executive director, but also as a parent, thinking about how do you create intentional spaces for this type of community building, the time, the resources to do that, when it doesn't always result in exactly what our society wants, right? That type of production and what that means. And that we haven't designed our time, designed our spaces to allow for that, right? And recognizing that type of community building, that type of connection is not an extra, right? It's not just something that's nice to have, that it's actually vital to our existence and to our well-being, and how difficult it is to actually do that in the structure that we've set up. And so maybe that's not the most hopeful answer, but I was thinking a lot about how I agree entirely. And also there's a lot of particular barriers around, who gets to belong, and when do we make space for that type of work for belonging and that type of work to build connection in our current conditions.
Yeah, wow. So that's, it's interesting, TK, as you're talking, after just having listened to Dan again, you use the word space in a particular way, creating the space. And I must say, as I'm hearing you, that concept of space, having just heard Dan, has expanded. It's way more than the physical space or the psychological or the emotionally safe space. It is an integrated possibility space, and it's making me think a bit differently about the interconnectedness of all things, and including when we talk about creating space, we need to expand what we think about that. Anyway, that's something that you've tickled in this brain of mine. Dr. Browne.
Yeah, TK, you said something there that I really appreciated, and it was regarding your discussion of talking about masculinity. And it prompted me to think about a course that I'm teaching right now on resilience. And at the beginning of the course, I contrasted two different tropes in popular culture that we see in movies that kind of contrast the idea of what we've been, I think, lied to about as a society as to what a resilient individual is, and rather what resilience actually looks like when we think about it through the lens of interdependence and belonging. So the kind of quintessential example, these movies are a little bit before my time, is like Clint Eastwood in The Good, Bad, and the Ugly. That kind of lone cowboy riding through the West. He's always coming or going, never staying for long, doesn't depend on anyone. He's always seems very grumpy and irritable and not really pleased. That doesn't seem like the greatest guy to be around. But this was the celebrated icon. Like this was who, at least in the history of like American film for a very long time, was heralded as the pinnacle of masculinity and the hero of the Western world at a time when there was a lot going on between capitalism and communism and so on and so forth. And then, so that's, I think, the example that we were lied to about, because I think we know enough now as a field, even though those tropes still exist in pop culture, that relationships are good for mental health, and good relationships are good for mental health. The other example that I like to use that I think is a more realistic version of resilience is my favorite movie of all time, and that's Forrest Gump. And we know that Forrest Gump had some difficulties that were likely genetic difficulties around the time he was born, with some of the things that he was facing. But then when you look at his life course and you see how he succeeded, they were all through interdependence, whether it was through Jenny when he was a child, or whether it was through Bubba and Lieutenant Dan when he was in the military, so on and so forth. So I think we don't often view Forrest Gump as a model of resilience. We view Forrest Gump, or at least I did until I really thought about it, as, a guy who was in the right place at the right time and got maybe lucky. But I think it might be more useful to think of that as an illustration of what resilience is. And then, it goes without saying that both of those characters are male and, or men, I should say. And I think that is a really interesting distinction, to contrast, the Clint Eastwood Lone Ranger type archetype versus somebody interdependent like Forrest Gump. I wonder what you think of. Do you think I'm out to lunch with my analogy here?
No, not at all. Though it's been a long time since I've watched Forrest Gump, so now I'm like, I need to go back and check it out again there. But I think it's really true, and it's particularly interesting in masculinity studies, right? I think a lot of the concepts that we're talking about today are so in direct conflict with a lot of the ways in which masculinity is understood by a lot of folks. And so when we would do work around trying to unpack, what's harmful masculinity versus what's healthy masculinity, in the like kind of more harmful pieces, there was a lot of not asking for help, not being emotional with the folks around you, and also a lot of things that I would kind of classify as like, well, this is not my problem, right? So if something is happening to other folks around you, to your community around you, that wasn't necessarily your issue. Your issue was to, be successful, to be strong, to be the best. And part of being the best means that other people are worse than you, and that's fine, right? And so that picture of masculinity that is supported in a lot of pop culture, that's supported in a lot of places, doesn't really also connect well with this idea that we can be connected to one another, we can build community, we can care about things that are beyond our own experience, and just generally doesn't encourage any type of community-based connection. So, I think there's a lot of interesting pieces, particularly around masculinity development and the way that we raise boys and men, that are directly impacted by these types of discussions.
One thing that I've been thinking about, though I haven't seen this perspective out in the world as much as a parallel perspective, is that we know now, and especially with the, Donna Strickland at the University of Waterloo winning the Nobel Prize in Physics, I think only the second or third female to ever, the second or third woman to win that award. There's a lot of discussion around women in STEM. However, I don't think that there is a complementary discussion of socializing boys into the helping professions. Boys becoming nurses, psychologists, early childhood educators, so on and so forth. And I think while we need to ensure that we have our women in science, technology, engineering, and math, we also need to ensure that we have models for young boys in education, in healthcare and early life, and in related disciplines as well. And I think that, it's two sides of the same coin. And I think in order to foster that socialization, we need to be addressing it from two sides of the same coin.
I love your examples of the rugged individualism that was so celebrated in American culture of Clint Eastwood in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. One of the problems is I'm now going to have that music in my head for the entire weekend. When we think about Forrest Gump and the interconnectedness, is back to Dan's theme. And so the outcome of this rugged individualism is the stereotyping and the self-construal that has been imposed on men and women. We've been stuck almost as if as I'm listening to you, stuck in the rut of this rugged individualism from which falls all of these consequences. And what he's really trying to imbue in us is this hope that we can shift the dialogue from this rugged individualism to more of a collective, that I had mentioned, and I want to go deeper with Dr. Dan about Ubuntu, which is this concept that I am because we all are. I see his wisdom, which is so embedded in indigenous ways of knowing, the hope and the way forward.
You're listening to the Thought Leaders Podcast, featuring Dr. Jean Clinton in conversation with Dr. Dillon Browne from the Whole Family Lab at the University of Waterloo, and T.K. Pritchard, the Executive Director of the Shore Center. This podcast is an extension of the Human Connection Generator event, brought to you by Ella. We rejoin the conversation as Dr. Clinton asks about belonging.
Are there things in the community? So let's get to hashtag belonging, and from your different perspectives, what can people take from your wisdom to think about? How do we make your neighborhood, your region, one where no matter where you are, you have a sense of belonging? What do you think?
When I think about belonging that's happening in the community, I want to tell you a short story that I think is something that for me demonstrates belonging in some of the programming that we offer. So Shore Center offers a newcomer health program, which is provided both to adults as well as children, and adults and children together. And last year we had a young person in our group. And these groups are facilitated by a person with newcomer experience, usually in the language that folks are most comfortable speaking. So most of our programs are facilitated in Arabic, for example. And one of the youth in the group was really struggling at school, not feeling accepted by their peers. These are kids that are usually 8 to 12 years old. This kid was 11. And really, not finding a space where she felt comfortable and supported. And the peers who were in this newcomer health group started a WhatsApp group with this youth, even though they didn't go to the same school, talked her through what those experiences were like, gave tips and tricks for ways that they had adjusted to school here, really provided empathy and a lot of validation for what this youth was feeling. And from that, you can see that this youth then also felt more comfortable engaging with her non-newcomer peers, and the folks that were willing, the non-newcomer peers who are willing to be supportive and kind. Now she felt a little bit more prepared to have conversations with them, as well as finding spaces to validate that the other pieces and the bullying that she was experiencing was not okay. And this youth who had gone from not feeling any belonging, her mom would tell our group facilitator that this child's outlook, her happiness, her willingness to engage in school had entirely changed. And of course, there's going to be other factors in her life, but I think those are one of the things where you recognize that belonging has to also come from a space of validating people's individual experiences, particularly their experiences of oppression. And that when we create these spaces sometimes when we talk about belonging, we talk about it in a very blanket way, in a way that doesn't recognize the complexities of what people experience. And so I think we really have to look at, how do we build connection? How do we build these spaces, these clubs, these groups in our classrooms and beyond, that allow a lot of room for recognizing that our experiences are not the same. Um, However, we can still connect with one another, and that we can do that in a way that still really gives power to who we are, and validates what those experiences have been. And so, a lot of that, right, I think, is about how we set up our spaces for belonging, how we provide spaces that allow folks to see themselves reflected, right? The idea of having a newcomer facilitator, for example, in our newcomer group is really important, for folks to feel that bit more of a sense of cultural safety as well, and also some shared experience. And similar, when we facilitated queer groups, having folks who are queer and share that lived experience, again, can be so important, as a place to start building community, because I don't think that people can connect even more broadly to community when they don't feel safe, when they don't feel cared for, when they don't feel validated in who they are as individuals. And so I think those types of layers continue to be so important when we think about belonging, that those individual experiences are still vital as well.
If I may, Tika, you said a few things there that I just wanted to jump on. It prompted me to think of a few things relating to Jean's earlier question regarding, what sorts of things that we can do as a community. And, certainly I think the work that your organization is doing is a stellar example of that. Another example that comes to mind locally is an agency like the Sanctuary Refugee Health Center and Kitchener Downtown Community Health Center, and how these organizations have taken the mandate of, primary care or even healthcare, and just really expanded upon the scope of practice, the meaning of practice, and really looked at, not only whole children or whole individuals, but whole families. And with that, something that I've seen in my own work with Sanctuary Refugee Health Center, for example, is the way in which the network of helping seamlessly intersects with things like faith community. And I think, Dr. Siegel's work is so spiritual in nature, and it's just absolutely wonderful. I think, at least in my training as a clinical psychologist, people may have mentioned the word religion or spirituality. I could count the number of times on one hand that came up in like 15 years of school. And this is a major, major, major source of support and resilience and strength and cultural identity and lived experience that is not, I think, recognized enough, at least in traditional mental health circles where I usually hang out. In fact, I'll share with you a caveat from a study that I actually just put the finishing touches on this morning. And we were following 500 families, 1,000 children over the course of the pandemic. And parents who had higher levels of religious or spiritual, we didn't differentiate between those two things, higher levels of religious and spiritual beliefs and practices at the start of the pandemic, had better coping skills, what we call more adaptive coping ability, roughly 6 months later. And then 6 months after that, they had lower levels of mental health problems. So religious beliefs, spiritual beliefs are naturally occurring protective factors for individuals, children, and families. Are also a big part of socialization. And I think that they're often overlooked in our kind of medical model view of people. And there are things that I think that we should be fostering, cultivating, and ensuring that the faith communities are not only connected with one another, and also with our healthcare system, our mental health care system, with our universities, and with really all pillars of the community.
As you both talk, I'm reminded of Dan's work on attachment. And TK, as you're describing the groups, Dan has 4 S's of attachment: that you feel seen, that you feel secure and safe, and therefore you're soothed. And it seems to me that that's what you're creating there. Dr. Browne, as you're describing the connection to religious spirituality, it seems to me that those 4 S's are involved there as well.
I found that when we want to make an argument, or when at least I'll focus on myself, when I want to make an argument that I think a particular service or a particular issue or a particular program is necessary, helpful, and also a moral imperative, I find that it's helpful to make an economic argument about that. And as a result of that, much of my research has not only focused on evaluating human outcomes, so like mental health, sense of belonging, so on and so forth, but also looking at the ancillary costs associated with health and social service utilization. There are enough studies out there now that we know that it actually costs more to not help people, because those people do end up elsewhere in the system. And to be catastrophic about it, at the end of the day, if we don't create healthy development supporting, family supporting communities for people, the worst case scenario is that people end up with catastrophic illness or in justice systems, and that is extremely expensive. So when you follow cohorts of people over time, you can actually measure what it costs to help and what it costs to do nothing, and then see what naturally occurring health and social services those people are using. And as I mentioned, doing nothing often costs more to the taxpayer, at least in Canada.
I agree. These are really important questions. And you're absolutely right around the economic impact is always, see, capitalism, we're back there again. It's a great way to make the argument because people hear it. But I also think, depending on the policymakers that you're working with, the idea of storytelling is still really important, and seeing the real lived impacts of this work, because we do see people move emotionally on these issues when they hear the stories, right? And so making space for that storytelling, I think, is so vital. I think, when we look at parents, one of the issues in engaging parents in this is that a lot of parents are also not living in a way that is connected, or living in a way that we might be talking about raising our children, for many, many reasons, right? And so I think there's opportunities to work with parents more around ourselves, trying to figure out what our space is in community, doing that work, connection, in order to be able to also share it with our children. So there's, I think, work both with parents that lots of folks are doing, but there's still, I think, more opportunity. And then I think you're right in terms of the tangible pieces for parents around making the information accessible, but also really talking through parents around, what does this mean? And I know this is a very niche example, but in my life, not having access to the same community during the pandemic, we've also used tools like books, right? Books that you can recommend to parents that teach children and show children about the broader world, about their connection to the community, about families that don't look like your family, about those types of things. And I think making those types of resources available to parents, also making them available free to parents, recognizing the barriers to purchasing those types of resources. What are those ways that we can actually take this information and practically say, okay, I'm a parent that works 9 to 5 and my kid has 17 things after school. And so how do I actually work this in? We need to give people tools that they can use and things that they can use and integrate into their lives to expand this conversation and start from somewhere.
Yeah, well, what I've learned about policy and policymakers is that to understand the language and the lens and the reality that they are in, they can be working very, very diligently on a paper, and they suddenly have to drop it because the minister has to come in and make a talk somewhere. And so I think if we can have empathy and compassion and seek to find the common path with policymakers and friend making, then we can do great things. So for example, that is how the early years, how does learning happen? got to include belonging, connection, expression, and well-being. And that's in our kindergarten document as well. That happened not just with the blinding the data around economics, but very much with the building of relationships and connections.
The whole concept of othering, and as we kind of further build belongingness among people, I think the idea to listen, to hear, and hear the other person's perspectives. I think the more we do that, I think the lesser we would feel pushing people away, especially their thoughts. I think that's the only way to overcome different views, but also kind of consciously listen and consciously reflect and kind of use the kind of moment to kind of build that capacity together. If not, I think the further we kind of go down this path, the more hate, the more groups get bogged down in their own specific views. That hurts. So I think we have a lot to learn, but I think if we listen first, listen very intently, I think we might be able to overcome the othering.
You've been listening to the Thought Leaders Podcast featuring Dr. Jean Clinton in conversation with Dr. Dillon Browne from the Whole Family Lab at the University of Waterloo and T.K. Pritchard, the Executive Director of the Shore Center. This podcast is an extension of the Human Connections Generator event brought to you by Ella. Sanjay Govindaraj, the Director of Indigenous Initiatives, Anti-Racism, Accessibility, and Equity for the City of Waterloo, hosted this episode and will leave us with a few final thoughts.
Dr. Siegel's conversation with Jean asked us to examine and extend our definition of self and connection. There is a tension when fostering and developing belonging when it's a small definition because it also inevitably involves othering. Reflecting on how we can identify and strengthen our ties without creating barriers requires big picture thinking. Thanks for joining me for this episode. It's given us lots to think about. I hope we can keep the conversation going.
Special thanks to the host for this episode, Sanjay Govindaraj from the City of Waterloo. Also to neuroscientist Dr. Dan Siegel for sharing his knowledge and insights. Thank you as well to Dr. Dillon Browne and T.K. Pritchard for their local wisdom and knowledgeable reflections. And thank you, of course, to our friend and advisor, Dr. Jean Clinton. You can listen to more fascinating episodes of the Thought Leaders podcasts, part of the Ella Human Connections series, wherever you find your podcasts. I'm Kathy Lee Porter, Ella's Activator. Thank you for listening.